Hello, everyone. I'll give a couple minutes for everyone to join. Um, I'm Andrea Smith, one of the coordinators of Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, and we are very excited today because we have two of the most knowledgeable peoples on the topic of what's going on now in the Middle East, Dr. Mae Cannon and Dr. Rob Dalrymple, who have been working on this both academically and an activist, pastorally, on all possible levels. Are they very well informed about what's happening and then what this means for evangelicals in particular? So we're going to have them present, give us the latest information on what's happening and how evangelicals in particular should understand and how we can respond. And then we will also have ample time for questions and discussion afterwards. So let's start off with Dr. Mae Cannon. If you don't know her already, I don't know why not, but she has just been working on this for so long, and is one of the founders of NEME and has written many books, has done so much work, and basically her reputation precedes her. So without further ado, May, can you start us off and let us know what is going on and what should we be doing?
Sure. Thanks, Andy. And I'm really grateful NEME is hosting this. So I'm May. I serve predominantly as the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace, but I also am on the NEME leadership team and was one of the founders of it. I'm an evangelical, even though it might not look like it. And I feel like I should just take a quick minute and tell you, when I was in seminary, I don't know if you know Trinity in Deerfield. I have to give you all my evangelical credentials because I'm wearing a collar. But I did my Bible at Trinity. And then when I was in seminary at North Park, I was a chaplain in a Catholic hospital. And people kept thinking I was a nurse. And so the Catholic chaplain said to me, "You have to start wearing a collar." And then people started calling me father. But I'm wearing a collar because I've had some meetings where people might assume that I'm not in ministry. And so I'm a devout believer in Jesus. I just learned a term about evangelicalism, a dissenting evangelical. And I think I'm going to start calling myself that. Or a 19th century evangelical. So I'd love to, in that spirit, I'd love to pray for us. I think this conversation, we're going to talk a lot of geopolitics today, and they're very, very relevant. One of the things I talk about a lot is as you hear the news, pray the news. Billy Graham used to do that all the time. And that's my hope as we talk about the geopolitics today. Geopolitics is just geography, and then, the political dynamics at stake. So join me, please. Lord God in heaven, I do believe that you are with us across distance, the digital divide, wherever two or more are gathered in your name, you are there also. And so as we enter into this conversation about Iran and of course what's happening in Israel and also the dynamics of the broader Middle East, Lord, I pray that you would give us eyes to see and ears to hear. And as followers of Christ, you have called us to be your hands and feet in the world. And so I pray that as a result of this conversation, we would know how to better pray and how to better respond and better pursue peace as we seek to be obedient and follow in the footsteps of Jesus, the Prince of Peace. So go before us, I pray, in the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen. That's a little bit of a vast juxtaposition because now I'm like, let's talk about the timeline of what's happened in terms of Iran. But I do, as I share this news, I really do think it is also a spiritual practice to pay attention. And I'm going to start at an odd place. I'm going to start at October 7th. And you're going to say, why are we talking about Gaza? Why are we talking about October 7th? I've been saying the last several years, October 7th, 2023 was a day that changed history, but it was not when the ongoing violence between Israelis and Hamas began. And it's really, really important to understand that the current US, Israel, Iran war is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in the context of this broader war on Gaza and, what people have said is the war between Israel and Hamas. October 7th was a day that changed history, but it was not the day that violence and conflict began. And I think contextualizing Iran in that context, we have to acknowledge that there have been decades of occupation of the Palestinian people and that there's all these dynamics in the Middle East, which we can talk about more, that the escalations with Iran started to surface. So I'm going to go to a timeline. I'm not going to start on April 29th. April 29th, 2026 is when the most recent escalations where the U.S. most actively engaged in war on Iran. I mean, the U.S. Began a war on Iran on April 29th, 2026. And we can talk about the legality of that and the conversations that are happening on Capitol Hill in terms of the war power resolution. But I'm not going to start on April 29th. I want to start back in October 2023. So the October 7th attacks, Hamas and other militant groups attacked Israel. 1,200 people were killed, 240 people plus were taken as hostages, which triggered the Gaza war. And subsequently, in months following that, the death toll of Palestinians who were killed was 75,000 people. The vast majority of the experts around the world have said that is a genocide. We're not going to talk about that right now, but Iran didn't start fighting Israel immediately, but pretty immediately after October 7th, Iran's allies or proxies began to respond to the Hamas attacks and to Israel's attacks on Gaza. Hezbollah got involved, the Houthis in Yemen got involved, and other militias got involved. So all of 2023, or most of it, after October 7th, 2024, you had these proxy wars that were happening. So really under the surface, Iran and Israel have been at war since that time. You had dozens of U.S. attacks all over the Middle East, but they were considered against little tiny militias. So most of you probably didn't even know that was happening. And that's really, really important to understand. I'm talking dozens of targets at a time, these militia groups that are what are called Iranian-backed militias. So that was called a proxy conflict. Iran and war, state to state, hadn't begun. But I would argue April 29th is not the starting date. October 2023 is when it began. And all the way since that time, we've been warning against a broader Middle East war. And we said pretty much since the beginning, in the first few months of war, that this already became a broader Middle East war, not just between Hamas and Israel, but Hezbollah, which we've seen escalate now, of course, in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen. For the last few years, the Houthis in Yemen were attacking any ships that were headed to Israel. So that's been a major place as well. The first direct Israel-Iran confrontation happened in April of 2024, and it went on through kind of October of that year. But there were kind of two major Iran attacks. So the first was April 2024. Israel struck Iran. Israel struck an Iranian diplomatic site in Syria. It was like the Iranian consulate or something in Damascus. And Iran then responded with a missile strike and a drone attack on Israel. So you might have heard of the drone attacks on Israel. Most people, and again, U.S. Western news sources don't report about that attack of the Iranian diplomatic site, but that was April 2024. In mid to late 2024, there were numerous additional strikes that occurred. And then there was another major escalation in October 2024. Now, prior to that, June 13th to 24th, 2025, I feel like I should have put this on a chart, so we can follow it. There was essentially what we would call a full-scale short war. It was 12 days, and it was between Israel and Iran. Lasted 12 days. This was when Israel launched major strikes on Iran's nuclear sites and military sites. Now, Israel would say that these were preemptive attacks. Iran retaliated, and the U.S. joined in on the strikes. So again, we're talking June a year ago, right? And so part of what's important to understand, again, I'm repeating myself, but what's happening now is just an escalation of what's already been happening over the last several years. Then we went into a phase, so this was late 2025, 2026, and the relationship and what I'll call the war between Iran and Israel escalated into a broader war. And so tensions were remaining high. And then in February of this year, I think I might have been saying April of this year is when this began. Forgive me, I think I've been misspeaking. I apologize. February. It didn't make sense. I was thinking, what month am I in? The broader phase of war actually began in February 2026. And Israel launched, with U.S. involvement, new strikes on Iran. Again, Iran retaliated. Then you have the period that we're in now, February to April 2026, and you've seen full out war. You've seen, President Trump saying we're going to, destroy all of the Iranian people. We're going to eradicate them. And so we'll talk more about what's happening now in that regard. So the current war began. Oh, I was reading April 29th. That's the date that I wrote these notes. So I apologize. Like I was so prepared. How could I be so wrong? Oh my goodness. As of April 29th, the war officially began February 28th, 2026. This was after Iran missile strikes killed several Iranian leaders. I just had a meeting today with the Egyptian ambassador to the United States, and we were talking about this. And he was saying Egypt warned the U.S. not to do this because the U.S. The US doesn't understand the dynamics. The Iranian government is the Ayatollah and the religious leaders and the political leaders, and they are so intertwined. And then the actors or the implementers are the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. So you have these three bodies, these political actors, the Ayatollah, the religious leaders, and then you have the Iranian military guard. And so what happened during February, not April, February 28th, what happened was almost that whole entire top tier of leadership was killed. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, he was killed. Hezbollah and Israel also responded and launched missiles. And then Israel began bombarding and invading Lebanon. So we can't talk about like what's going on with Lebanon without talking about Iran, because they are also intimately connected. After the US attacks on Iran in late February, there were weeks and weeks of bombing. I'll talk in a minute about one of the attacks that happened right afterwards, where very early in the war, one of the first things that we heard was that a girls' school was hit and more than 150 people were killed. And I'd point you to, there's a great NPR episode, horrific, but really, really important. It's an NPR episode that says this is the first US war that has led with AI technology. And what you might, again, not have heard in Western media is what happened with that girls' school is bad information was fed into AI. And so it was a missed target. It was totally a technological mistake. If you had Googled things, you would have been able to understand that this was a girls' school. And that was kind of one of the first evidences about what's been happening. And so that was in the first days of war. Since then, President Trump has gone so back and forth about what we're looking for. One of the things that happened just this last month and in the last several weeks is that President Trump has said he is not going to negotiate peace with Iran. I'm sorry, I'm so all over the place. My goodness. One of the things that happened in the last several weeks is that the Strait of Hormuz was closed, and President Trump is using this to try to get Iran to agree to ending, their complete nuclear program. And so the Strait of Hormuz, 25% of energy sources comes through oil, et cetera, comes through the Strait of Hormuz. And so that has been closed. Only 10% of traffic has been allowed in. And the US is using this to try to force Iran to the table. And it's not working. So Iran is saying, no, we're going to negotiate peace first. And Trump is saying, no, you're going to open the Strait of Hormuz first. And we're now at this like impasse. And so one of the things that we're really, really afraid of is that this could go on for weeks and weeks, if not months and months. And I'll close. I have other things to say, but I obviously need to get more organized because I'm like, what month is it? But I'll close by saying one of the things that's happening right now is not only, the death tolls, which I have somewhere, I just can't find them. Not only the death and the destruction in Iran, not only the devastation on Iran, not only the whole Iran Israel conflict and then the US's role, all of that is happening while the entire world economy is now being significantly affected. So oil prices have increased. I just heard the statistic that $200 billion left the UAE because when Iran responded to the Israel and US attacks, they responded all over the Middle East. We actually evacuated our staff and had them leave the UAE. The UAE now has the Iron Dome defense system because Iran was attacking all of these sites that were US allies in support. And so the effects of the Strait of Hormuz closing are not only the direct effects of war, it's the indirect. I'm going to use the word, it's definitely hundreds of millions of people. I would imagine that billions of people are being affected because we're hearing that the energy crisis and the escalation of cost. Think about if you are living at poverty level or below poverty level, and the cost of gas prices or oil prices that you use to cook your food or the very little oil you use has gone up exponentially. We are seeing statistics of effects on poverty, which I'll pull up because I have it in front of me, but I'll pull it up if you have a question about it. You are talking about a humanitarian crisis around the world for those who are vulnerable and in poverty. So you have the immediate effects of this war, and then you have the indirect effects as well. I really thought I was so organized, so I'm sorry if that did not make sense to the degree that I wanted it to. We all now know, of course, that the recent war between the US, Israel, and Iran began on February 28th, not April. So that's a takeaway from that. But I think what I want us to talk about, and I'm eager to hear what you have to say, Rob, is what's that mean for us, right? Like, yeah, our gas prices are higher, et cetera. But for those of us who choose to follow Christ, how do we respond to this? You know, what's the role that we can play? And I think that's something I'm sure we'll talk about.
Thank you so much, Mae, for just giving us all those facts and the context that we need to make sense of this very complicated situation. And now we'll turn it over to Rob, who, if you aren't following his work on Determinetruth, please do that because it's a great place for analysis, bringing together the current realities with a biblical analysis, as well as the several books that look at the Bible specifically to inform us about what we should think about what's going on in the Promised Land, and what does that mean for our evangelical theology today. So, and he's also one of the co-founders of NEME. So, Rob, please take it away and provide us more contextual analysis of what we should make of what's happening now.
Well, thank you again. Thanks for having me in May. That was excellent. I was April 29th, something happened I don't know about in the news in the last couple of days, but I'm glad you recovered that, and maybe you'll have an opportunity to kind of look at your notes a little bit more because I'm interested to see some of the other information that you have. And what I want to do here is just kind of start the conversation, kind of give us some overview of a few different things, and maybe some of that we can springboard further, whether your questions or Andy's questions or whatever. I'm going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint presentation kind of running through this here. Let's see, does that work? Can you guys see that okay? Okay. And let me begin by noting, that one of the issues that's arising is how do we even justify this war? How do evangelicals justify this? And one of the things I'd like to say is this is so much worse than we can even begin to present in this discussion today. The concerns that I have, and maybe Mae will share them as well, are so great, it's almost inexplicable. So evangelicals have typically supported foreign wars under a bunch of pretenses, just war theology, which of course was propagated with the Gaza war. Oh, Israel has a just reason to defend itself, and we could discuss that in more detail as well. But these are some of the basis for it. What I would simply start with saying is, look, we are called to be peacemakers. We're called to bless and not curse. We're called to not seek retaliation, but pray for our persecutors. We're called to weep with those who weep. We're called to pursue peace. We're called to a sacrificial dying for the sake of our enemies. And James 3:18 says, the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. What we so often do with these verses is we just personalize them. Oh, that's my personal interrelations, and that doesn't apply to the nation and to nations as a whole. And I think we need to stop and go, no, this is an ethic that we as Christians need to understand, that we should be working within this particular parameters. So I discuss a lot of this in my book, Land of Contention. I kind of lay a theological foundation. It was specifically addressing the Gaza war in particular, but nonetheless, it lays a biblical theology. It's 93 pages long, so it's not a long book. It kind of lays a biblical theology for justice and peace, and for the kind of the framework for God's people to kind of look at these issues, and then it discusses this issue in light of Israel itself in particular. But let me move forward. What I would simply also add to this context is the fact that we, the people of God, simply transcend any ethnic or national identity. You know, Galatians 3:28, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. So to have any allegiance to a national entity, which often happens in modern evangelicalism, this Christian nationalism that's ever encroaching, that kind of sanctions whatever the United States does as this Christian nation, I think is fundamentally undermining the biblical gospel and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that, by the way, goes for the state of Israel as well. And we can discuss Israel and the theology of Israel, which I've done quite a bit. Thank you, Andy, for the plug on Determinetruth, on our YouTube channel, obviously in our blog posts, and even some of our podcasts, things like that as well. And you can go to determinetruth.com to look for all that. But I would also simply say that the point that Mae brought up, and I think this is kind of the big point that I think we really want to stop with, and that war often has a greater impact on the poor and the marginalized, and specifically some civilians. So on a global basis, this is unbelievably chaotic. They're talking about severe energy crisis in India and China, but there's been 1 million people already estimated that have lost their jobs in Iran. That's 1 million people. And this isn't the leadership in Iran. They're eating the same food today that they were always eating. You know, Vladimir Putin's eating the same food today that he was eating before the war in Ukraine started. This doesn't affect them. It affects the people. Estimates are that 1.2 million people, a quarter of the population in Lebanon, are going to face acute hunger over the course of the next year. And the problem is that of all the targets that the United States and Israel are doing in Iran, only 1/3 of these targets, according to a Bloomberg report, are even military targets. In other words, 2/3 of the targets are civilian targets and civilian infrastructure. You know, we know about the female volleyball players that were killed when Lockheed Martin, in the very beginning of the war, decided to test their weapons in the opening days. And so I think we need to stop and go, this is a bigger issue than we want to understand, than we think, and there are greater consequences to it. So let me kind of go on that basis there as well. And that is, we need to stop first off and go, there are corporate powers, there are a military-industrial complex and the Israel lobby that are behind this war. And it's not just we have this just cause of helping the people of Iran, which we can discuss later, May. I kind of question if that's even really, truly a motive. So there's a wonderful
Say what
documentary.
motive you just said. I just missed it. I'm listening, but you went fast.
The motive of, we have this altruistic motive of helping the poor people of Iran under this despotic regime. I've heard that so often. You know,
I was going to say, I didn't say that, did I?
No, that's just common out there amongst the evangelicals. Like, yeah, I don't think that's a legit motive, but we can discuss that more. But Al Jazeera has like a 22-minute special called How the Military-Industrial Complex Captured U.S. Democracy / the Business of War. It's on YouTube. James McCarty, which I had him on a live stream on Determinetruth, edited a book called The Business of War, Theological and Ethical Reflections on the Military-Industrial Complex. I highly recommend both of those. Wonderful works there as well. But the reality is this. There are 5 big U.S. firms that dominate the global weapons sales: Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. And these firms are, well, they need war. I mean, the reality is they're funded by war. Look at the revenues that they've brought in here. In 2021, they were making $53.6 billion from the war machine. In 2024, it's $61.4 billion. That is a lot of money. The CEO, by the way, of Lockheed Martin, I understand, said that when this war broke out in Iran, it's a, quote, golden opportunity for Lockheed Martin. So the reality then becomes these civilian companies are controlling our military in many, many ways. And the decisions to go to war or not go to war are not really in defense of U.S. interests or our interests, but in the interests of these corporate conglomerations, especially the military and industrial complex. You might be familiar, of course, with President Eisenhower's closing remarks in 1961 when he said, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex." That's where the expression got coined. "The potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." So the fact that Trump comes to power and says one of his first objectives is to meet with Xi in China and Putin in Russia and say, we want them to cut all our military expenditures. That was one of the first things he said he was going to do. And then within a few months, he's like, hey, you know what? We need $1 trillion military budget. And now he wants $1.5 trillion military budget. It's like, what's going on? Well, I think the corporate influence and the power of this corporate conglomeration is behind it. The problem then is this: Congress cannot say no to war. It's amazing. I'm sure Mae has a lot more information on the War Powers Act. How does Congress not step in and go, hey, the Constitution requires that only we can advocate for war, so here's this War Powers resolution that says Trump can't just do this without our approval. And they voted no, because 98% of U.S. lawmakers
More than once they voted no.
Yeah. But 98% of U.S. lawmakers receive campaign donations from the arms industry. And it's more than just that. You've got congressional committees that oversee every piece of legislation for the military spending. And the chairs of these committees, Roger Wicker, for example, the head of the Senate Arms Committee Service, he's the largest recipient of donations from the military-industrial complex. The Senate Appropriations Committee, which oversees all federal government spending, is chaired by Republican Senator Susan Collins. And she's a massive recipient of federal funds from the military-industrial complex. And it even goes deeper than this. There's actually an estimated 37 lawmakers who either themselves or their direct family members have traded stocks in the weapons companies worth up to $113 million. And so it's really clear where the incentive to fight these wars is coming from. And it's coming from, I think, largely the military-industrial complex. Now, let me kind of go on a little bit further to kind of touch, well, what about this just war theory? The problem with just war theory, is if we were to look at well, what are the pretenses for this just war? The whole idea that we're hearing is that this war was for regime change or to stop Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, or for to stop their ballistic missile campaign, or maybe the nuclear enrichment program. And of course, now we need to add opening the Strait of Hormuz up, because that's a new one that's caused by us. But really, I don't see how in any way, shape, or form that we can justify this war by using just war theory. Just war theory, requires that there be a just cause needed for self-defense. Okay, we went in this war because, our Secretary of State admitted this, because Israel told us that they were going to bomb Iran, and that meant that they were going to bomb our military bases, so we had to defend ourselves. Well, actually, you could have just told Israel not to bomb Iran. You don't have to go to war. A just war also requires that this is a war as a means of last resort. There's got to be a reasonable chance at a just solution, but you also have to have the goal of peace and explore all opportunities for peace, meaning that this is the last. There's no other hope for peace. But the reality is that war in June of 2025 and that war in February 28th, in both instances, the United States had on the docket peace discussions with Iran, for the next day in the June 12th war of 2025, and I think maybe even within the next couple days in the war that began in February. So it's well, on what pretense then do we have a just war? So a couple quick thoughts here. Number one, every nation assumes that their war is just, and that's just the reality. The Russian Orthodox Church has baptized and sanctioned Putin's war on Ukraine. So I would imagine Ukrainian Christians are saying, oh, we're justified in going to war with Russia. You can't have both sides fighting this. How do we sanction all these wars? The problem then becomes, the war on Gaza was said to be a just war. And it's we kind of thought from the beginning there's not going to be a lot of justice here. So the next problem becomes this. The nations in power, point number two, are the ones who control the information. So when we try to decide if this is a just war or not, we are limited by the information that we have. And the reality is the nations in power are the ones who are controlling the information. And they lie. Biden repeated on October 7th, they had beheaded babies. I saw the pictures of them. We now know there were no beheaded babies after the October 7th uprising. That's just simply not true. We know of 2 children, infants that were killed. One was killed in the mother's arms. There were no beheaded babies. But all these lies that were perpetuated to justify the U.S. and Israel's attack on Gaza, it's like Colin Powell, just go back to then, we have solid, this is a quote, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, quote, solid sources. These are not assertions. We are giving you facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. And he went on to say that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which we now know they didn't have. So how do we justify a war when we don't really know the information, whether this is even a just war? All right, third, war leads to more violence. That's Jesus, Matthew 26:52. All who live by the sword will die by the sword. First day of the war, we kill Khomeini, and we thought, oh, that's going to bring about a regime change because that's one of the goals of this whole thing. And all we did was make him a martyr. And you make him a martyr, and that means that you're going to create more radicals that are going to then have this antipathy towards the United States, and maybe even understandably so. When you kill all these people in Gaza and you leave, 15,000 or 20,000 children as orphans, you just recruited for Hamas. Hamas has an easy group of people to recruit from because their family members have been killed and they want vengeance. So violence does not bring about peace. Almost never does it work. So Trump came to power with this whole idea, and I wasn't in favor of him coming to power, but I thought, well, at least he's going to stop these foreign wars. I mean, he said he was going to do that. And he called out the military-industrial complex, and he called out these regime change efforts repeatedly. And then all of a sudden now, within a few months, he's like endorsing them. I think the powers that are behind that, of course, are leading to this. All right, number 4 here, I'll go quickly. Let me click on this. Number 4, here we go. War inevitably leads to war crimes. Mae's already referred to the first one here, the targeting of the school in Manab that killed 168 teachers and children. And by the way, military experts say, even though that was an AI issue, and we know that AI, that when you begin a war, usually the first set of targets are actually vetted out a long time in advance. In other words, you've decided in advance, if we do go to war, we're going to have these targets. So they had plenty of time to vet that AI, that mishap, by knowing that used to be a government, that used to be a military facility. In other words, it was a military facility, but I understand it actually hadn't been a military facility for, if I'm not mistaken, for like 15 years, if not something like that. Yeah. So it's just like, what are you doing? All right. We know over 1,400 Iranians have been casualties, at least more than 200 are children. Destruction of the infrastructure. Israeli strikes have damaged 132,000 U.S. Israeli strikes. 132,000 civilian structures, including homes, hospitals, universities, and bridges. How do we justify this as a just war when we're attacking civilian infrastructure? Israeli strikes on fuel depots and refineries in Tehran and Al Borz, which are affecting the global economy. As Mae sort of alluded to, Trump said, quote, we are going to hit them extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong. That is a war crime because that's civilians that are going to be affected by this, not just a regime. He reportedly threatened to bomb, quote, all of Iran's bridges and power plants and warned that a whole civilization will die if Iran did not comply with the U.S. demands. I think just yesterday or 2 days ago, no more Mr. Nice Guy was a recent tweet as well. All right, so moving along, wars are seldom standards for just wars are seldom, if ever, met. This is just a simple fact that we know from the history of wars that nations don't fight wars for just causes. They only fight wars. Maybe there's a just cause out there, and you could always say the Hitler issue. Okay, that's great. But they always have their own national interest at stake. Why didn't the United States enter World War II? We knew about the gas chamber. We knew all the concentration. We knew all that stuff, but we stayed out. Why? It wasn't for this just cause. It was only because we went into World War II, because our hand was forced with Pearl Harbor. So nations, that's my 6th point, that nations always act in accordance with their own self-interest. If if the whole idea of fighting this war against Iran is because they have this horrific regime and we're doing this for the sake of the people, then why are we not fighting a war against China? I mean, the human rights violations in China are pretty significant, or North Korea. And I think the answer is because, well, A, we probably can't win a war with China, and B, because Iran has oil. And we know the importance of controlling this. And I think, of course, there's more to discuss there as well. So Major Smedley Butler, I got to quote him because it's worth doing so. If you have not read his book, War is a Racket, it's like 35 pages long. He says this. He says, I spent 33 years, and by the way, he's a major general. This was like one of the most decorated U.S. soldiers in history in the early 19th century, early 20th century. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service. And during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for national city bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. Okay, this is the way it works. All right. So, and then the final point here is that most wars can be avoided simply by diplomacy. So I'm sure there's a lot more to discuss. And that raised a number of issues, and some of the issues I raised I didn't discuss, so we'll see how that goes. But I hope that's a good starter there.
Thank you both very much for this very helpful information. If people want to put questions, we can add them. And while we're waiting to hear any questions or comments, I'll just start with some questions myself. I was wondering if you could speak to kind of what I'm seeing anyway, some of the shifts in evangelicalism, particularly generationally. We're hearing more discussion that Charlie Kirk was actually was stopping the war in Iran, and we're seeing more, for instance, divisions in Turning Point USA, where younger people are directly calling this out, and arguing that Trump did not keep his promises to
Right.
keep us out of these wars. And also just seeing some big shifts around Israel, and this is amongst conservative evangelicals. So what do you see going on in your work, and are there any opportunities or possibilities given these shifts?
Go ahead, May.
Do you care if I go first, Rob?
No, not at all.
Because I want to start with something I heard you talking about in terms of just war, and pick up on some comments you made and then
Okay.
seek to answer your question, Andy. I thank you for the framing of, how this is being reported, how people are understanding, your comments about the military industrial complex, which Eisenhower was the one who coined that term. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
I thought all of that was very helpful. I do think, though, when you said there's no way you can look at this and see it as a just war. And I agree with you, because I think it's a totally unjust war. But I want to try to explain why many evangelicals think it's a just war, because I think that's really helpful to deconstruct.
Yeah.
Many evangelicals see this as a just war, and the war on even Gaza, even with the devastation, because they have this paradigm that is I would say, a false binary, a false bifurcation of good versus evil. And
Right.
we, if I may, this really means we, white Western Americans, or white Western ideals, etc. We are God's chosen people. The Americas, the New Zion. So we are good, and people of the Middle East who are brown, they are evil. This good versus evil paradigm. And the root of that is a false reading of the story of Abraham and the sons of Isaac and Ishmael. There is a way that often the church just teaches that Ishmael was cursed and Isaac was blessed, instead of reading Hagar and seeing that she literally names Ishmael, the God who hears, right? She cries out to God and God responds to her. And then you see throughout that Ishmael's actually blessed. So if in fact the Jews are the descendants of Isaac and Muslims are the descendants of Ishmael, even when we have a conservative reading of the scriptures, it's a bad read to say one was completely good and one was completely evil, and God was on the side of the one and not on the side of the other. That's the answer to why this is a just war for many fundamentalists or even maybe evangelicals who believe that. So I thought that was just, I wanted to make that point. This is directly related to that. Also, for Jewish people, there is a Jewish ideology which can be supported by Jewish religious assumptions that if someone is going to harm you, you are not only justified in responding to them, you're obligated to prevent the harm. So this whole Israeli strategy of preemptive strikes can be backed up by this ideology and a Jewish theology. Not all Jews think this. I'm not trying to make it, this is not all encompassing, but that's just another framing. So a preemptive strike, even if Israel starts wars, is justified under that ideological framework. I think we can talk about the problematic nature of that. But I think that's important. I can talk about.
Comment on that really quickly, Mae?
Yeah.
But
sorry, I didn't even get to this question. Sorry.
No, that's great. Because I did mention at the very beginning, fear of ideological enemies, Islamophobia is, of course, a prevalent thing behind this as well. But you did a good job of noting that, well, the war, 2007, right? And, of course, we actually know that there's actually a prehistory even to that. Because of course the closure of Gaza in 2005. So often we see that this war with Iran, well, it's a preemptive strike. I've heard for years Israel is not safe. There's an existential threat of Iran. But what happens, is, well, for 47 years, going back to 1979, Iran's been a problem. It's like, well, why don't we go back to 1953? If we're going to go back, because in 1953, we overthrew, with obviously helping Britain, the democratically elected government of Iran for the interests of oil, right? Because British Petroleum was in control of the oil, and the Mossadegh wanted to go ahead and nationalize the oil. And we did in 1953. Not only that, but we put a Shah who was a brutal dictator in power, who was violent. So the overthrow in 1979 of this Western imposed dictator who was oppressive to the people. Let's go there. Or how about we actually realize the fact that we've been waging war against Iran for a long time? Because if this is justified because of a preemptive strike, we've been waging economic war against Iran for years. And that economic war, again, affects the people. The whole idea of economic war, of sanctions, is to make it so difficult for the people that they just revolt against their government and that they overthrow the government so we don't actually have to. Well, that's immoral. What we're doing, another discussion, what we're doing in Cuba right now, this is war. It's unjustifiable war, and it's criminal acts. So I think we need to realize there's a bigger history going on. And by the way, and again, you're totally right, because it's a we, it's an us, them. Because as soon as you say, well, Trump is bad, well, you aren't going to vote for Biden. It's like, okay, I'm just talking about this being bad or that being bad. So when we talk about the United States and Israel being bad actors here, that doesn't mean that we're saying that Iran's a good actor, right? No, we're simply saying we're American evangelicals looking at American evangelicals and the support of our state for a war that we don't think is justifiable. So thank you.
That's a really, really important point. One of the things that happened after October 7th and the ongoing hostilities between Hamas and Israel is that Iran clamped down. And one of the ways that they perpetuated violence against dissenters was that anyone accused of being a spy for Israel was executed. So you had I think the executions, I feel like the number in my head is like 2,000. I don't know. I don't know if it was that high. I know it was definitively in the hundreds, hundreds of people killed, to quell dissent, for example. And I want to get to Andy's question. Andy was just saying, what's this look like in the next generation? I think it looks entirely different in the next generation. One of the things that we have talked about is, we were mentioning earlier some stalwart evangelical colleges and, education. We talked about liberty. Maybe this was before the webinar actually started. Wheaton is another one. If you look at conversations about the Middle East on Wheaton, 10 years ago or 20 years ago when I was with World Vision, I don't know how many years ago it was, but it was very, very different than it has been. Night and day in the last 5 years. We couldn't bring a Palestinian onto campus to be able to talk about even Palestinian Christians, a decade or two ago. And now there are open discourse and discussion. And what we're finding is that young people are actually changing their parents' minds. And so there's a major shift. I have it, if people want it, just email us at CMEP and I can give you a link. We have some of the news articles that talk about those statistics of the shifting perspective of evangelicals. There's tons and tons of articles about that. But one of the main groups that's leading the way are young people.
Yeah.
Thank you. And can you also answer the question here about what was the conversation with the Egyptian ambassador and ceasefire?
Yeah, so this was, I think, specifically related to Lebanon. And, one of the things Rob said is when things are reported in the news, that's not what's happening. So there was a ceasefire, and I don't even know what month it is now, so I'm not going to give you dates or months. But when the ceasefire began, more than a year ago, it was sometime last year when the ceasefire began, everybody would always say ceasefire in quotes. And what they meant by that is every single week, often daily, there were attacks predominantly by Israel. Hezbollah attacked some too, but it was disproportionately Israel attacking the south of Lebanon. And you'd have one death, 2 deaths, half a dozen deaths. So part of the ceasefire agreement was that Hezbollah had to withdraw north of the Litani River, and Israel had to withdraw out of Lebanon proper. Israel never withdrew completely. They always maintained 4 specific locations. And there were incidents where UNIFIL, the UN, somebody's going to have to tell me what the acronym stands for, peacekeeping forces, they're called UNIFIL. There were numerous incidents where there were injuries, and UNIFIL actually withdrew because there were so many attacks. Now, the war that is happening right now on Lebanon is a completely different level. You are having entire villages, predominantly Christian villages in the south of Lebanon that are being completely decimated. Now, but this is not new. It's been happening gradually and incrementally, and now it's happening on massive scales. And you're hearing members of the Israeli security establishment talk about the destruction of the south of Lebanon. We have evidence and reports of white phosphorus being used. So farmland is being completely destroyed. And I think, I'm sorry, the question was specifically, what did we talk about with the Egyptian ambassador in terms of Lebanon? And really, we just talked about what's happening there. We talked about the instability in the Middle East. Egypt's greatest interest in response to Lebanon, Gaza, Iran is their economic stability. And I'll just close with this because I found those economic numbers and I just want to give them to you real fast. Because I found them. Egypt's priorities in relation to Iran are de-escalation to keep the ceasefire permanent. And a permanent ceasefire doesn't mean the ceasefire that I was just talking about with Lebanon over the last year. And then also Egypt has really one of their top 3 priorities is that Iran's nuclear capabilities would be capped. Egypt was actually critical of the JCPOA. That was the agreement under the Obama administration, the joint something of disapproval. I do not do acronyms. We'll have to look that one up too. But
plan of action, Joint Commission for Plan of Action or something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I knew I just call it the Obama Iran deal. It's important to understand the ceasefire conversations as it relates to Iran. Those are being led by a quartet, but it's not the Western quartet. It's not the quartet with the U.S. and England. It's the quartet with Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. And the
Mm.
revenue numbers are that Egypt has lost 45% of tourism revenue, and their shipping that goes through the Suez Canal, this is because of the closures on the Strait of Hormuz, which is predominantly to economically put pressure on Iran. There has been 70% decline in the number of ships traveling through the Suez Canal, which
Wow.
means an equivalent roughly 70% decrease in revenue. So Egypt's main goal, and this would relate to the Lebanon war as well, is certainly the stabilization of the region. They don't want their neighbors at war because that destabilizes them, but it's really the economic interest. It relates to their economy, which is suffering greatly. So he used the analogy and said that the UAE lost $200 billion where people either left or moved businesses or lost sales. I don't know how that number was calculated. He said, $10 billion is a huge amount for Egypt. $200 billion would just be catastrophic.
Oh, thank you. And Rob, could you maybe weigh in, especially you've done so much work on many levels, the pastoral level, the work you're doing with Determined Truth, like given the information and given the shifts, like what do you see as reaching evangelicals in terms of thinking of different possibilities for how we engage our own government, how we weigh in on these wars?
Yeah, I think what we see, I hope I'm going to get to your question, Andy, is, and my concern, I'm writing a new manuscript that the book should be up by next year on the gospel and the kingdom, is that we've lost and that's why I said this is a lot bigger issue than what we're even portraying here, is that we've lost sight of the gospel, we've lost sight of the kingdom. When we wed ourselves to any nationalistic entity, we're good, they're bad. We blind ourselves to the reality that the kingdom of God stands opposed to all kingdoms of the world, of course, lovingly, sacrificially laying down our lives for those kingdoms of the world, but by no means condoning them. They are foreign. So we're losing the younger generation because they're so concerned. They see the globalism as real. They're on TikTok. They're on all these social medias. They see the global realities, and then they see the older generations of American Christians going, "Oh, that's wrong." And we're sanctioning the United States. And we can't just simply sanction, anything the United States does. And again, I'm not saying one's good or the other's bad. That's the whole point. I'm actually concerned a little bit, and we would need some social media expert to come in, because I don't know if people realize this, but TikTok has been purchased by the largest private donor to the Israeli Defense Forces. In other words, the largest private donor for the IDF now owns TikTok and is in the process of buying, I don't know if they've completed that or not, CBS, CNN, and other networks. So if the reality is that the younger generation was totally influenced by what they saw on social media, but now the social media is it's being filtered through an Israel only or Israel pro-Israel lens. I don't know how much they're going to see about Palestinians any longer. I don't know how much they're going to see about the suffering. They're only going to hear this one side of Israel's concerns. And again, we don't mean to minimize Israel's concerns. But the reality is neither side none of the sides are good actors or just actors. And I think we need to realize, I'll make this note here. I know we're running out of time, but when we sanction the United States as though it's a just actor, we've killed 200 people in boats off the coast of Central and South America. That's murder. There's no Well, they had drugs. There's no crime they've committed against the United States until they cross international waters into U.S. waters. And if you bring drugs into the United States, the consequence is not death. The consequence is we go aboard the boat, we find the drugs, we detain them, we arrest them, we put them in trial. And so what we are doing is unjust. We are just as much unjust actors as anybody else. I'll say just as much, of course. I'll qualify that a little bit there. So I think we need to be really concerned. So I'm not certain. Social media is not my cup of tea in terms of where the younger generation is going, but I do know the younger generation is not where the older evangelical generation is at. A good thing and a bad thing. My concern is that they're actually losing sight of the gospel in their efforts at least their efforts are for justice, but are they taking the gospel with them, if that makes sense to you?
Right. Thank you. So we're starting around time, but I'll just give you both the last word. Maybe if you could, where do you see the things going with the war, and where should evangelicals jump in now? Does it make sense? What do you see happening right now, and what should be kind of our priorities? Maybe we'll start with you and end with Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I think God have mercy if we have another year or two of this. I mean, I think there are significant concerns that both parties, Iran and the US, are becoming more deeply entrenched, more stubborn, more less willing to negotiate. I mean, Trump just said this past week, he pulled out the negotiators. I feel like it was Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, and Jared Kushner. And he said, we're not going to come to negotiations. If Iran wants peace, they can give me a call. So that was just like 2 or 3 days ago, right? And so it's not looking good. On the other hand, I don't think the US can face the economic impacts of the whole security crisis, the energy crisis on the US, let alone the global pressure will be unbelievable if this continues, much longer. And so one of the things that happened is that Europe, when the US and Israel attacked Iran, Europe said, we're not intervening, we don't support it, but we're not going to speak out against it. I'm like, why? I feel like, to your point, Rob, when you talk about all these companies being taken over and things, we should be very, very concerned because people, states, institutions are not intervening. The EU does not support this war at all, but they're not telling anybody they don't support it. But when their economies take a 25% hit, they're gonna oppose it. And so that's what we're going to see happen. We're going to see a rise of international pressure. But there's no easy way out. I mean, we've got tons of troops in the Middle East, et cetera. So where do we go from here as Christians? I would love to invite people to sign up for the NEME newsletter. I think, maybe Raven, you could put the link, the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. We do webinars on a regular basis. One of the questions I have, we normally do a once a year forum. We have not been together at a NEME forum in a really long time because the last NEME forum we did was around Church at the Crossroads. But we have activities around International Religious Freedom Summit in February, the National Prayer Breakfast. We also have devotions and prayers. I'll put in the chat a prayer vigil we did in partnership with the Lausanne War and Peace cohort. And sometimes there are people who speak on these prayer vigils and people who join who would be considered enemies based on their perspectives. And we pray together for peace. That's not where we should end, but it's a great starting point, right? And to pray for peace with an open mind, not just to pray for peace that everybody thinks like I do and they should change their minds, but to pray humbly before God. So our invitation would just be to engage. We'd invite you to come alongside of us.
Yeah, thanks,
And Rob?
Mae. Yeah, my concern in terms of the geopolitics, for which I'm not an expert, Mae, you're much more of an expert than I am. I'm a biblical scholar. Is that you have people in power that can't admit that they've lost, and therefore they have every incentive to continue a war because they can't actually end this war saying that they've won, and the fear of nuclear, involvement is a great concern. Obviously, I think what we as Christians need to consider is the fact that the travesty of any war is how it impacts the poor and the marginalized. Okay, so I'm paying a little bit more because I filled up my gas tank the other day. I can afford it. I'm okay. Most Americans and most people around the world can't. And where's our concern for them? And then you add to the fact that all the trucks that bring food and that bring goods to the stores are now paying more for their gas, and they're going to charge more for the goods. Again, the wealthy, no big deal. But for the poor, it's going to greatly impact them, even here in the United States, let alone globally. I think we also cannot have this discussion without saying, do we realize what's happening in the West Bank? Do we realize the fact that Israel's using this pretense to go ahead and make tremendous havoc and disruption in the West Bank? What about the Epstein files? There's another whole issue. We've forgotten about that because we have these women that have been severely abused. And the church's call is to speak up for the sake of those who are marginalized, for the sake of those who are oppressed. So what I'm doing at Determinetruth, what we do at Determinetruth primarily is to call attention to these things in the larger pictures, but to say, because these are a challenge or a threat to undermining the gospel itself. So we focus a lot on what does the gospel say? What does the scripture say? What's the text say? I'm doing a couple series right now, or one series in particular on the book of Revelation, which is my expertise. I've written a commentary on the book of Revelation saying we've misunderstood this text. Obviously, a lot of this issue that we're discussing here is apocalyptically and eschatologically justified, which is simply not the case. But if you go to our YouTube channel, we got 15 15-minute videos walking through the book of Revelation to say, how do I understand? Because understanding Revelation is understanding the gospel. And I think when we understand that, we're going to have a better context for what to do. So I think Martin Luther King Jr. said something like, the church should not be the slave of the state nor the master of the state, but the conscience of the state.
Oh, sure.
I think that's the whole idea, that we are directly supposed to speak to the church to say, come out of her, my people, do not participate in her sins. And this is what it means to be gospel people and kingdom people, concerned for justice and rightness around the world. And thank you again for having me.
Hi everyone, I'm having weird problems with my computer, but we're going to be having a class on our NEME's curriculum starting June 2nd from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. So just email us for more information on that. And stay connected as we learn more and work together to make a better world for our future generations. Thank you so much for coming.